Yeah.
No, okay, go.
I welcome everyone to Tuesday's August 7th MakerDAO community meeting. So there hasn't been a ton of news this past week. However, we do have a couple very exciting guests that we'd like to talk to and hear about their cool stories. So we'll be meeting Lenka and Jordan today. Lenka, do you want to kick us off and tell us a little bit about your background and how it is that you've landed in the world of Maker?
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Lenka from Copenhagen. Really nice to meet you. I'm the new community lead for Europe. My little story how I got into crypto is that basically just went to some open source event and learned about Bitcoin. I was curious about it. And I have no technical background, so I'm humanities, social sciences, but I'm a proof that there's a space in the crypto for everyone, regardless of the background. And I have been active in the past 4 years with another blockchain startup that's been mostly connecting the traditional and the crypto world by providing payment processing and exchange. But now I'm ready to dive deep into a more decentralized, more exciting stablecoin space. And yes, super stoked to join Maker. I don't know, there's just so many exciting things and projects and people to work with. So really looking forward to make some great events and engage with the community online and also at different locations. So looking forward to meet you all over Europe and internationally.
That's awesome. I know that you just started. Do you have any plans yet? Or are you still trying to get your feet? Or are there going to be any conferences coming up in Europe that are of interest?
Well, I just started to poke around. There's a local event called Tech Festival. It's maybe it's not that in-depth technological, like most of the developer meetups tend to be like, but we'll try to build some more presence because the office in Copenhagen is quite new. So we'll try to, do some simple intro meetups and different events as part of the Tech Festival that will be in September. Then I will visit Berlin for the ETH Berlin. And I guess we're all very excited for the DevCon in Prague, end of October. Yes, and then there's a little bits and pieces. On Monday, I'll be presenting a challenge organized by CARE organization, the humanitarian organization about the Bifrost project where we're participating. So that'll be this Monday. And then there's a lot of little exciting projects. But yeah, let me just get my feet to the ground first.
Wow, you're off to a good start, though. So, tell us a bit about CARE, though. I'm not familiar with that. What do they do?
All right. CARE is a humanitarian organization, international humanitarian organization. And they have created a challenge in collaboration with Copenhagen FinTech Lab. That's a local FinTech office and office space and hub. MakerDAO has submitted the Bifrost project as one of the projects for the challenge. I guess the challenge is actually challenging the CARE organization's way how they address the issue of cash and loans for the underdeveloped countries. So basically, it's bringing the financial services to the people from developing countries.
So it's a direct giving sort of organization?
I guess it's more of a charitable organizations that are trying to make an impact in the developing countries.
Well, that sounds interesting. It's an enormously ethically complex sort of thing to deal with, especially direct giving. So that's interesting. Is there going to be any videos or any recordings of it?
I don't think so. I think it's going to be a very short presentation, and then it's mostly one-on-one with the different interested organizations that are collaborating on this project. But I'm still learning about Bifrost and what it actually involves and everything. So I'll be smarter very soon.
I'll stop grilling you since it's your second week. It's not fair. All right.
Yes.
Actually, but before we moved on to Jordan, because I know we have a lot to talk about there, I wanted to, like I said, or actually Jess said earlier, it's been an amazingly quiet week in the world of Maker, at least externally. Internally, there's a whole lot going on. And I think our next meeting or two is going to be full of some exciting announcements if our timelines sync up. But I wanted to do yet another reminder of our weekly call schedule that we're doing now at Maker. So we have these calls that we're in right now that are general informational type calls to what Maker's been up to and what we've been doing in the past. On Wednesdays, we've been having a foundation proposal meeting with Rune, and we're going to wind those down for the next couple weeks. So there won't be one tomorrow. There'll be a notice. We'll put out a notice when the next one is going to roll around. But our Thursday meetings with Stephen Becker are going to continue for the long term, because those they're chock full of content, and we're getting a lot of great reception for those. If anybody hasn't seen them, I suggest hitting up our YouTube channel and taking a look, because it's sort of like a free course you can audit on finance and risk and Maker itself. I'm still trying to keep up with those guys, so there's some amazing stuff happening in there. I think that was all I wanted to talk about. Yeah, the lack of things to talk about was the major topic. So, Jordan, you want to introduce yourself and give us a sort of sense of what you've been up to?
Yeah, so I'm Jordan. I kind of work on UX research and other kind of product things at Maker. My path into like blockchain things was really, it was incredibly interesting to read about blockchain from the perspective of like UX, right? As you have these like really novel experiences that are going to be built and are being built right now, like especially at Maker and like the design team at Maker. And yeah, it's just incredible to see the different mental models and things that people have, like Web 2 versus Web 3. So yeah, and I guess most recently and maybe relevant to this conversation was like the governance UX research that actually David, someone in our community, was like a big part of and gave us a bunch of great feedback based on.
If you need more feedback, I'm always here.
Exactly. There you go. So yeah, I mean, that was an incredibly interesting and like fascinating process, as I think Rich maybe has touched on this before. Is like we've been trying to do governance as humans for so many like a long time, right? And to think about like that as an interface is incredibly interesting. And yeah.
Well, let's take I want to do a bit of a dive into some of the things you've learned, but kind of for my own edification. I come from a highly technical background, so the UX stuff, sometimes it's hard for me to wrap my head around exactly what it is you guys are up to and how you do this kind of stuff. So can you give us a super high level overview of what user experience design is and how you guys go about approaching this kind of problem? Yeah,
so I think that at a really high level, people are always trying to make progress, right? So we're like the motivations are largely the same, right? They're trying to get from point A to point B, and in the middle of that is usually some type of interface, usually some type of object. And what we're trying to do with user experience is, generally speaking, we're trying to either give people the capabilities to do what they want to do, such that they can see through their motivation. Like humans are goal-seeking, aspirational beings. Like we're trying to get places, and also we're trying to, like, as opposed to giving them capabilities, giving users capabilities, we're trying to take away obstacles, right? Any friction that is getting in the way of getting you from point A to point B, we're trying to take that away, or give you the capability to do what you want to do.
I guess the hard part is anticipating what those what helps and what doesn't help is the hard part, and especially in a crypto space where we're kind of inventing paradigms as we go along. So is that one of the excuse me? Is that one of the challenges that you guys are running into? Is that sort of the experiences that people have become accustomed to in the Web 2.0 world don't always apply in the Web 3, or they don't have that toolbox of assumptions that are required to deal with some of these tools?
Yeah, I think probably the largest one is this idea of value attached to almost everything, right? And thinking through that as, so if you're walking through a DApp, right, or you're going through a DApp and you're doing all these different experiences, right, or you're doing all these different interactions, it's not necessarily native for you to think about value when walking through these experiences, but that's an integral part of the experience, obviously. So I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles of getting a lot of new users onboarded into kind of Web3 or DApp user experience coming on from Web3 or Web2 rather.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So in the traditional Web2 world, people are just sort of now, after like 10 or 15 years, realizing that they're the product and that's why things are free, moving into this new world where they're expected to sort of micro pay for almost everything is probably a tough hurdle.
Exactly right. I also think the notion of trust is something that's really interesting, right? Like, I think services before or products before that have given us trust have largely been predicated on a lot of these kind of data monopoly, rent-seeking applications. Like, you trust someone on Airbnb because of their Facebook profile, right? But now we're thinking like, whoa, maybe that's not the best idea with Facebook. So this idea of identity and trust is something that I think is also like incredibly relevant and largely being built. I don't think we have the answers yet. We have the questions. Yeah.
Well, actually, one thing I want to ask you is, and this is sort of a new or kind of a paradigm that the community in general is sort of arriving at far too slowly, I think. But this idea of hiding the complexity of the blockchain, it seems like most of the applications leading up to the last 6 months or so were really focused on almost strangely exposing the underlying mechanisms of the blockchain. And now we're starting to see that more and more apps are trying to hide the fact that there's anything crypto about it. Is that am I interpreting that process correctly, or is that something that Maker is looking at as well?
So I think you're interpreting it correctly, but I think that there's a bit of nuance for this specific reason. So when we were thinking about hiding complexity before, it's been because it's not necessarily relevant to the person who's interacting with the product. Now, I think when we talk about hiding complexity in blockchain, it's a little bit more nuanced because now it's incredibly relevant. Like, it is incredibly relevant for you to know, okay, can I go and check this on like Etherscan? Can I go and see, what happened in this transaction? Or like, who's the owner of this address or something like that? Those are perhaps complexities that maybe in like a world where you don't necessarily care about those types of things, they can be abstracted away. But I think at Maker and with other Web3 products, we want to hide the complexity in a way, but we want to give the option, the ability, going back to this idea of capabilities, because it goes into the motivation of users to understand, hey, this is what's happening and this is how I can kind of get ground truth on the actions I'm taking.
Okay, that's cool. So I think I see where you're coming from. So you can't abstract away all the complexity and all the delta that's involved with crypto, because that's part of the value prop, right? Like, that's the reason why people are here, because things are behaving differently. So you can't just pretend that this is a different type of Facebook or that's a different type of voting tool. It has to be. That's interesting. So you still need to educate people that there's some new paradigms here that they need to understand.
Exactly. It would be like, in my opinion, it'd be like saying in my opinion, it'd be like saying you're using Facebook and we're going to hide your friends, right? It's a core part of the value proposition of say Facebook or a product like that, to say, hey, here are your friends, here are friends that you may know, etc. With blockchains and other dApps or dApps built on the blockchain, I think that it's core to the value proposition of saying, hey, like, we need to be transparent. We need to show you like what's going on, or at least give you the ability to understand what's going on in some sense.
That's cool. So actually, I'm going to ask you sort of a generic question, but it might I'm interested. What do you think's the hardest part about somebody who's unfamiliar with crypto, interacting with UX these days? Like, what's your major challenge when you're onboarding people?
Cool. I think it's different for different types of users. For a lay user, or someone who's new to crypto assets, I think it's the anxiety that is around this idea that there's no point of recourse. There's no coming back, right? If you send money or something like that, it's gone. It is what it is, right? And you can't go back. And we have sort of ingrained into using products, in other experiences, like you can always call the customer support, right? You can always email somebody, you can return a product or a shipment or whatever, and that's just not the case here. So I'd say that's probably the biggest hurdle that we're going to face. And then with more sophisticated users, I think it's again, going back to that transparency and more details and security around sending value from point A to point B. I think that's another one. And then for the middle cohort of users, I guess you could say maybe somebody like myself, it's the trade-off between convenience and security and transparency, right? So a product like, say, Coinbase gives you this trade-off. They give you more convenience at the expense of likely some security, right? Like you don't own your private keys at Coinbase, right? You don't know where they are. You probably don't even know what that is, right? So yeah, I'd say those are the three main things.
That's awesome. So where do you think that, I know that it's impossible to predict the future in this space, but where do you think that we're going? Do you think that third-party developers, like the second layer, will begin to replicate some of those safety nets that exist in the traditional space? Or do you think that there's going to be we're going to continue down this road of sort of increased privacy and sovereignty and sort of lack of training wheels concept?
Well, the completely candid answer is I don't really know. My personal opinion and hope answer is I hope that there's going to be this idea of users owning their data, users owning their private keys and being competent and proficient in these types of areas, because I think that'll make for a better internet, frankly, right? And just really novel experiences that we've not seen before. But I think that it's probably going to go down the road of, having these kind of training wheels, as you said.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. I have a feeling that, I think we've already seen that there's inroads happening where there's 3 or 4 projects that I'm aware of that are attempting to do insurance, token insurance or wallet insurance, or to sort of give people this comfort of, if they lose their Trezor, somebody will be able to cover that, or if they send money to a contract, that they can get 20% of it back. It's interesting to watch this stuff develop. I think it's a part of the process of people just sort of discovering what money is and what the old traditional financial system did for them. And now that they have something to compare it against, there's a lot of people are beginning to question things that they didn't question before, which is a fascinating process.
Okay.
So, okay, that was a good high level, and we talked about some base principles and stuff. But what I wanted to talk to you about today specifically is governance and some of the challenges that you ran into when you were doing testing. How do you explain to people what governance looks like in the crypto space, particularly when, if people do some basic research about how governance works, or some of the proposed models for governance, they get sort of insanely complex very rapidly, like reverse Dutch auctions and the list goes on of just madness. How challenging was it for you to explain to people what governance was and how it works?
So I think, to take a step back, sort of, there was 2 really forms of research. The first is like a discovery idea, where you're trying to get how people really think about governance in the crypto space, and for those folks or those users, they were highly sophisticated and they were in the community, right? So they kind of get it. But when we talked about usability research, when we already have an interface that we wanted to get feedback on, it got a little tricky, right? Like we have these terms that we use in the governance, I guess, process that maybe not everybody understands, or a lot of people didn't understand. And it was a little bit confusing to know the difference between like executive voting and community voting. Like, what's the difference there? What's the root proposal, right? Like all these different things that were very confusing for people. So yeah, it was difficult. I think terminology was a big hurdle. And I think also just the model of understanding, like, what is the motivation here, going back to that idea of like motivation. I think the high level motivation that needs to be sort of imbued in the interface is like, people are trying to have influence over the system, right? They're trying to have positive influence. They're trying to have their say, right? So how do we build an interface that allows them to do that underlying motivation? And I think that's just a really difficult problem, because there's just so much there. There's so much that is around making these really complex decisions for people.
It must be tough, because I'm trying to think of what a corollary would be in the Web 2.0 world, where users are trying to cast a vote or make their voices heard in the direction of an organization or a product that they use. Are you aware of any sort of?
Not really. So a user brought up this new I think news platform. It's called like Kialo or something like that, where it tries to give you like the relevance or how factworthy the information is that you're viewing, such that you can make more informed decisions and have more informed perspectives about different political things. So that's one thing that people brought up. And then interestingly, when you had people with a finance background, they really thought of it as like a more decentralized board of directors or something like that, right? They really thought of it in those terms, which is sort of interesting. And then with users who are more part of the community, they more thought of it as like their own little community, like their neighborhood or something like that. Like, how would they make a decision on like putting up like a speed bump or something like that? Like, how do you get to consensus there? Is that like, how do you take in all of that information? Which I thought was a really interesting way for people to think about it.
What was your general results from the usability testing? Did you find that it's a challenge and people eventually surmounted it, or do you find that it's going to be tough for different demographics of people? Like, what was the general response to the UI that we're talking about?
I think the general response was somewhere in the middle of, and it's going to be a little bit of a cop out of an answer, but somewhere in the middle of highly confusing and like easy to use. The reason why I say that is because it depends on how much information is there, right? Like, if you have a really kind of easy vote or something, easy vote, quote unquote, then, you know, it's relatively easy to use. But if you have to make a really complex decision about, like, say, collateral types down the road, which we haven't seen yet, it's different. So yeah, I think it should be interesting.
I have a question. How many people did you use for user testing? Like, what was the extent of the research?
Yeah, so for the usability testing itself, when we had the UI, we tested across 3 different cohorts of users. So fund managers, like people who have a large holding of Maker, community members like yourself, David, who I talked to, and then extreme users, so people who maybe own a little bit of Ether or a little bit of Bitcoin, and they're not really familiar with governance, but they have some idea of like what a wallet is, things like that, to make sure that they could understand these more high-level, sophisticated things across about 10 or 11 people with in-depth interviews, like an hour and a half, talking to them, trying to get their insights.
What was the goal of the testing? Well, I guess, I don't know if that's part of your purview, but what is the idea that everybody from a wide range of backgrounds needs to be able to use this tool, or is the expectation that it requires a certain amount of engagement to want to use it, and that's the bar that you have to hit in order to understand what's going on?
That's an interesting question. So I think it's a little bit of two things. The first is that just generally when we're testing products or building interfaces, it's like you want to always focus on the two extremes, right? You want to focus on the person who's like the power user and such that you can get the edge cases for them. And you want to focus on the person who has no idea, like the very beginner, and the middle will take care of itself. So that's kind of a best practice a little bit. And then the other thing was based on the discovery research, talking to a bunch of different people, like in an exploratory way, this idea of tragedy of the commons, right, comes up a lot, right? Like, well,
Do you have to explain that to people, or is it sort of understood when they come in?
So I think it's implicitly understood, right? Like they're like, well, why would I even engage in this? Like, why should I do this? Especially if I have like a little bit of Maker, like, why would I, why am I really going to have a say, right? So I think that's an issue too of being able to create something that incentivizes people to participate and to really get that, or to really solve for that motivation of having your say, to have a positive influence over such an amazing system.
Yeah, that's cool. But something that we talk about in the Thursday meetings as well is voter apathy and incentivization and the risks associated with that. As soon as you create, a way to profit from engagement, then you almost immediately create people willing to exploit that engagement for profit. So it's a tough one. There doesn't seem like you touched on that at the very beginning, but this is kind of a problem that people have been having for a millennia or so now, and it's going to be tough to fix that in the next 6 months. But is your goal sort of to approach that from an angle of a user experience angle? So just making things as easy to understand as possible, lowering the barriers to entry, I guess, to sort of counteract that natural inertia that people feel when it comes to getting involved?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So in terms of like tragedy of the commons idea, like, not like incentivizing participation in some way, I think lowering the barrier to entry or making it as engagement friendly as possible is like the huge goal, right? That's the thing to focus on, right? But I think something that you touched on that was interesting is this idea of like maybe malicious actors, right? People who would want to game the system in a way. And that's where I think this idea of like human biases and really thinking deeply about that from a UX perspective is pretty interesting. Like we've seen this in regular political campaigns and things like that, where you have one dominant actor who like can spread something that's not necessarily true to influence the system or influence the general consensus in their favor, right? For what everybody thinks are benevolent ideals, but in actuality, it's really malicious intent, right? So really thinking deeply about like the human cognitive biases that we have, like confirmation bias, anchoring, right? The availability bias, like all of these different things have to be like really deeply thought about, I think, from a
that's cool. So you take into account logical fallacies and critical thinking when you're building this.
Absolutely, 100%. So like a really like interesting example of that is like, well, should you show like who's voting for what, or who's this that voted for this? How is that going to influence other people's perspective, right?
The real problem of like ordered lists, whatever's at the top gets the most votes.
Exactly, because then you're going to have cognitive fatigue, right, going down. So like little things like that you wouldn't think make a difference make a huge difference, right?
Oh, that's amazing. So how do you come up with these paradigms? So like I was saying earlier, that we're kind of in uncharted territory a bit for some of this stuff. So is there some secret Telegram group where all the UX engineers get together and decide what the next 6 months of crypto is going to look like? Or how do you guys come to a consensus?
I don't know. I think it's a lot about talking to users from my perspective. Like, we just like to give a bit of a anecdote. We we had these assumptions about the governance interface, right, based on just talking to users in an exploratory way. And after having that initial MVP and then talking to 10 people, 10 users, 10 hours of talking, it's something not completely different, but there are assumptions that we made that were completely wrong, right? So I think this idea of talking to users over and over and over again and really trying to understand their perspective and where they're struggling or what they find great is going to make all the difference for not just Maker UX, but UX in any Web3 product.
So it's just like anything else in this space. We just need to keep on iterating and improving in the next version.
100%. Yeah.
Who else in the crypto world is sort of making inroads into the governance UX process? Like, who do you look to for inspiration in our space?
I wouldn't say governance specifically, but I think that there's a lot of different projects that take user experience into account in an interesting way. So there's this project called Colony. That's actually a governance thing, I think, that I think takes user experience into account in an interesting way. Even for their like centralized ethos, I think Coinbase really does the user experience in an interesting way. And even products like Shapeshift that really abstract away like the complexity and just make it simple to use for users. Like somebody who doesn't understand a lot about crypto assets, I'm sure could use Shapeshift and trade, some ETH for Bitcoin or Numerai or whatever they want to trade for. So those are a few.
Right on. I think that kind of exhausts all my questions. If anybody else in the room wants to ask anything, now would be the time. If not, it could be a good spot to sort of wrap things up. So Jordan, that was amazing. That was a good talk. I think that we might need to get you back on soon. Maybe after we release the governance dashboard, maybe have a chat with some of our users to see how they felt about it. That'd be amazing.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Lenka. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, David. I think that's it for us. So I'll see everybody hopefully on Thursday if you can make it, but otherwise next week. All right.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Hey guys, thanks for coming.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye.